Welcome everyone to this new Privacy Rules Privacy Espresso. My name is Alessandro Di Mattia, Legal and Executive Officer at Privacy Rules. And today I'm joined by Valentina Soto from the law firm Vanegas Consultores based in Colombia. And the reason of me having her as our guest today is because Valentina and the team of Vanegas Morales has been conducting a research on the topic of the request for consent of underage data subjects in Colombia, of course. And we would really like to know more about this research and which were the outcomes. So Valentina, thank you very much for being with us, first of all. And I would simply ask you as first thing, please give us an overview on what was the research about and the main outcomes.
Of course. Thank you, Alessandro. It is a pleasure for me to be here at the Privacy Espresso. So the reason why we have been making a research on this topic is because, as you know, there is an increasingly great participation of underage data subjects on the internet. They are becoming consumers of goods and services. So there is a lot of companies that aim at this group of interest to sell those services or those goods. So it is becoming challenging to establish strategies that are both legally and commercially viable. So I would like to tell you a couple of the tips that we have been implementing at Vanegas Morales to process the consent of underage data subjects in Colombia. So before entering into the detail of this subject, I would like to first clarify that there is three main premises that regard consent in Colombia for underage data subjects. So in general, consent must be requested for prior to processing the data, or at least at the same moment as collecting the data. It must be express and free, and in the case and informed also. And in the case of minors, it should be provided by their legal representatives. That is like the general rule. And also, there is a constitutional protection of minors' rights and best interest, and their interests and rights should be prioritized in any decisions or acts that involve minors. So, of course, when you consider this, initially our data protection law prohibited the processing of that data of minors, but our constitutional court regarded this as an unnecessary restriction to minors' rights and to the exercise of their access to health and educational services and to other services and goods that they could access. So our court clarified that the processing of data of underage data subjects is allowed as long as the controller pursues processes that benefit the data subjects and that respect their prevalent rights. And also, the data subject's opinion should be heard and taken into account according to minors' maturity and age. So this position was later set forth by a regulatory decree, and this is like the general panorama of how you should request for consent of underage data subjects.
Perfect, Valentina. Thanks a lot for this quick overview. I understand that the processing is something possible for underage data subjects. So how do they provide consent? How does it work?
So the general rule is that you can process the data of underage data subjects, but there is a legal restriction because underage data subjects cannot validly provide their consent or be bound by legal obligations until they become 18 years old. So our data protection authority has been very strict because it has conducted investigations where in general it has identified that controllers don't imply or adopt strategies to request for the legal representative's consent when they process the data of minors. So our data protection authority does prefer that the consent is provided by legal representatives. But there is an exception involving minors from 14 to 18 years old because they are considered young adults in our regulation. Therefore, according to our constitutional court, underage data subjects that have at least 14 years old may validly consent to receive information that benefits them, such as information related to educational or health services, because, of course, in these cases, parents could impede the access to these services to minors, for example, in the case of sexual health. So in the case of that we want minors to have their fundamental rights preserved and to have access to these essential services, in these cases, those minors can directly provide consent. but these exceptions should be examined case by case and applied quite carefully, since we already stated that the general rule is that our DPA requests that consent is granted by legal representatives.
Perfect. And Valentina, thanks a lot for this. And that's extremely practical and extremely interesting. Going more practical, what's your advice for clients that are interested in processing this kind of data?
Okay, Alessandro. So our advice to clients that process data that pertains to underage data subjects is that in general terms, go by the general rule and establish strong commercial strategies and technological procedures that allow you to directly request consent from minors' legal representatives. But we, of course, understand the challenge that this poses, because we know that minors are very active today, especially in internet services or apps. So in special cases where clients provide goods or services that benefit the minors, such as educational or financial services, and that they have clients that are young adults, which we already mentioned are minors from 14 to 18 years old, there is an option to initially opt for requesting consent directly for the young adults, only for the purposes related to rendering the services and providing information regarding those services to the minor. But when implementing this strategy, controllers should be very careful not to use information to carry out non-essential purposes, such as sending advertisement information. If a controller wishes to carry out additional purposes, they should prefer the legal representative's contact information to conduct those additional purposes, such as sending advertisement information, and they should limit the use of the minor's data to the essential purposes related to the good or service. In all other cases, such as when you process data of minors that are 13 years old or younger, our opinion is that controllers should in fact opt for the general rule of requesting for the legal representative's consent. So for this reason, we think that in compliance with the principle of accountability, it will always be a very good business strategy to invest on technological tools that allow to have a traceability on the process of requesting for the consent and mapping out processes that involve the processing of underage data subjects' data. Companies may also establish special channels to process parents' complaints and special security measures to differentiate and adequately protect information pertaining to underage data subjects. The key is to create strategies that creatively apply the law and facilitate processes for consumers and data subjects, and to also keep in mind that this is a very special category of data and should be protected and handled as such.
This makes lots of sense, Valentina. So thanks a lot again for all the information you've been providing us. I think that it's today it's key to start also using some sort of tools that can support us managing data. This is something that is happening more and more, but also being flanked by the right experts that can support you not only in establishing which one to use, but also how to use them correctly in a case-by-case basis. Because we have seen that there are also, different approach for different ages. So lots of things to keep in mind. So my advice, of course, would be for anyone interested in handling this kind of data to contact experts like you and the experts at Vanegas Morales Consultores. And that said, I think that we ran out of our time. So I would like to thank you very much again for being with us today from this very interesting explanation, and also to thank our listeners for being with us as well. I think that I will see you all next week with the next Private Espresso. And again, Valentina, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Alessandro. Have a good day.